At 6:18 on a pale gray morning in February 1943, over the frigid waters off the Aleutian Island chain, a single battered fighter clawed its way through low clouds and freezing mist. Inside the cramped cockpit, 24-year-old First Lieutenant Danny Cole flexed numb fingers inside his gloves and listened to the angry rattle of the engines that the base had christened the Junkyard Dog. Below him lay the half-frozen edge of Alaska. Ahead, somewhere in the haze over the North Pacific, radar said an enemy formation was coming in and Danny was the only one close enough to intercept. He knew exactly what that meant. The other P-38s were still being fueled or iced. The weather had closed in faster than forecast. The radar return had been messy. Multiple bogeys, no firm count. 6, 10, a dozen. Somewhere out in the gray, Japanese aircraft were droning toward a vulnerable supply convoy, and the only thing between them and ships full of fuel and food was one cobbled-together P-38 Lightning built from wrecks. He glanced along the twin booms and the patchwork paint. Wings from one crash, tail from another, and engine salvage from a third. Mechanics had welded and riveted her together like a Frankenstein project, then watched her roll out of the hangar with nervous pride. Officially she was a P-38. Unofficially the line chief had called her Miss Spare Parts. The pilots had gone with something less kind. "Cole's gonna get himself killed in that thing," one had muttered in the mess. Another had smirked. "Let him. Saves the Japs the ammo." Now, with the left engine giving its familiar cough as he eased the throttles forward, Danny shoved those words aside. 7 combat sorties in this airframe, 2 confirmed kills, 1 probable. The Aleutian front had eaten better planes and better men than him, but he and this flying scrapyard were still here. The radio crackled in his headset, Dutch harbor control fighting static. Lightning 3, bogeys northwest, bearing to 15, range for 0 miles and closing. No other fighters in position. You are first to intercept. Estimate additional lightnings airborne in 15 minutes, weather permitting, 15 minutes. At a combined closing speed of several hundred miles per hour. That meant he would meet the enemy alone. "Dutch harbor, Lightning 3, he replied, keeping his voice level, proceeding to intercept. "Advise when second flight is in. Copy. 3. Good hunting." The word hunting sat wrong in his gut. Up here, over these killing seas, no one ever felt like the hunter for long. Before the war, he'd been a mechanic's son from Tacoma, Washington, learning engines in a greasy little garage, coaxing life out of cars that should have been junked years earlier. His father had always said, "Metal's honest, son. If you listen close, it tells you what it can do." That simple faith in flawed machines had carried Danny into the Army Air Forces first as a mechanic, then, after an instructor saw how instinctively he understood engines, as a pilot. Sent to the Aleutians instead of some famous front, he'd found a world of knife-edge winds, fog that swallowed mountains, and runways carved out of rock and mud. When a Japanese raid had wrecked several of their P-38s the previous summer, Higher Command had written one twisted airframe off as salvage only. Not worth the trouble, the paperwork. Danny and the base mechanics had disagreed. Night after freezing night, with welding sparks mixing with snowflake, they had built what others laughed at, a fighter spliced together out of discarded metal. The first test flight had been a white-knuckle affair. The left engine overheated. The trim was wrong, the controls felt heavy, but she had flown. Bit by bit, sortie by sortie, adjustments and field fixes had made her into something more. Now she was his. He climbed through ragged cloud layers, the altimeter needle creeping past 16,000. The canopy glass was rimed with ice where the defroster couldn't quite keep up. Below, steel-colored ocean heaved around black rock teeth of islands. Above, a lighter smear of gray marked where the weather thinned just enough for combat. Lightning 3, Dutch harbor. Bogeys now 30 miles, Angels 18220. Likely bombers with escort. Priority is convoy Sierra 59. Grid, static swallowed the rest. Sierra 59. He'd seen the board in ops, tankers, ammo ships, freighters, escorted by a couple of destroyers that were brave but badly outgunned by aircraft. If those bombers found the convoy, steel and men would vanish into the North Pacific in minutes. He leveled off at 20,000 feet, building speed. His eyes swept the sky in a constant pattern left, right, instruments, up, back, front. For long moments there was only cloud and the endless gray line of horizon. Then spakes appeared. First 2, then 5, then a cluster. He adjusted his heading slightly and watched them resolve into twin-engine silhouettes in a loose V. Mitsubishi G for Embeddy bombers, thin-skinned but long-range, with smaller darting shapes of 6 zeros flanking them like angry hornets. He did a fast count. 7 bombers, at least 6 fighters. 1 P-38, His heartbeat slowed, as it always did at the edge of danger, replaced by a tight, bright clarity. Training and experience overlaid fear. He thumbed the gun switch on. A red light winked to life. 450 caliber Brownings and a 20mm cannon in the nose, all pointed where his gun sight looked. The P-38 didn't have wing-mounted convergence issues. If his aim was good, everything hit the same place. His ammo belts were full, but they would empty fast if he sprayed. Every second of firing was hundreds of rounds gone. This was going to be about discipline. Dutch Harbor, Lightning 3, visual contact, 7 bombers, 6+ fighters. Engaging. Copy 3. A pause. Reinforcements airborne, but weather bad. 8 of 10 to 15. Do what you can. Do what you can. Translate. You're on your own. He climbed a little above the enemy formation and slid offset, planning a diving attack on the bombers. The escorts spotted him quickly. 1-0 peeled up toward him. Another edged for position to cut him off. He refused the urge to dogfight first. The convoy below did not care how many fighters he tangled with. They cared about bombs. He rolled the P-38 onto its side and dropped into a controlled dive at the lead bomber, watching the airspeed needle swing past 300 miles per hour, then 340. The airframe shuddered, the patch panels and splice spars complaining, but holding. Tracers from the bomber's nose gun blinked toward him, then those from the top turret. The first thuds of hits sounded like rocks on a tin roof. A burst stitched his left wing, another slapped the right boom. A round tore through the canopy side panel, exploding it outward. Freezing wind knifed in. He waited half a heartbeat more. The Betty's cockpit filled his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger. The lightning bucked as all 5 guns spat fire. Tracers walked straight into the bomber's right engine. The nacelle erupted, black smoke turning instantly to flames. A sheet of burning fuel trailed back along the wing. The bomber lurched, the wingtip dipped, and the whole machine began to yaw out of formation. Danny flashed underneath so close he saw the belly gunner's eyes, wide behind glass, before the bomber staggered out of his view. A fragment thumped into his tail with sickening force. The P-38 shivered. He hauled back into a climbing turn, the G-loading making his vision gray out at the edges. The left engine coughed, an unfamiliar, rough cough this time. Oil pressure dipped. He eased the throttle on that side a fraction, coaxing rather than commanding. "Stay with me, girl," he murmured. "Just a little longer." 2 zeros dropped in on him from above and behind. Tracers sliced past. One round punched a jagged hole in his right wingtip. Another tore the rudder fabric. The natural instinct was to tighten into a turn and try to outcircle them. That way lay death. Zeros could outturn a Lightning all day at this speed. He shoved the nose down instead, into a dive now aimed at empty ocean. The P-38 surged forward, heavy, powerful, built for this. The altimeter unwound. The airspeed climbed into the uncomfortable zone where compressibility lurked, the controls wanting to stiffen. The Zeros chased but began to tremble under the strain. At the last moment, he rolled inverted and pulled up into a climbing half-loop, grunting as G-forces tried to drive him. Blood dragged at his vision. The world narrowed to the instruments and the feel of the stick. He came up behind one of the Zeros that had been chasing him. The Japanese pilot flashed past, suddenly overshooting. For one perfect second the Zero drifted across his nose. Danny kicked in rudder, lined it up, and tapped the trigger. A short, disciplined burst. His tracers cored through the Zero's fuselage and engine. Smoke and flame blossomed. The fighter rolled onto its back and fell, leaving a black smear across the sky. He didn't follow its fall. He was already looking for the bombers. They were off course now. The carefully ordered V scattered. One burned heavily, losing altitude. Another had wavered, engine straining. But 5 were still heading roughly toward where the convoy must be. His fuel gauges had already dipped more than he liked. All this high-power maneuvering was burning through reserves. His ammo counters showed his 20mm shells half gone. He had maybe 2 or 3 full-length bursts left before he'd be down to a handful of 50 caliber, Lightning 3, status. Dutch Harbor's voice pushed through static. Engaged. 1 bomber on fire. 1 damaged. 2 fighters down. Still 5 bombers inbound. Fuel and ammo low, but continuing attack. A pause. Understood. Convoy is altering course. Any delay you can cause helps. Second flight still 10 minutes out. 10 minutes could be the life of a ship. He angled above the formation and used the clouds as cover, diving in slashing attacks. In one pass he chewed into a bomber's wing root. It snapped and the plane rolled away, wing folding like paper. Men spilled out, white parachutes blooming uselessly over lethal water. In another, he raked a bomber's fuselage, saw the top turret go silent, then flame licking from open hatches. Each time he pulled away, the Zeros converged, angry and insistent. They were skilled, disciplined, and they had numbers. He danced at the edge of their reach, using speed and climb to spoil their shots, trusting the P-38's strengths and his own familiarity with its weaknesses. With every minute, his body paid the price. His arms ached, his eyes burned from constant scanning. Frost bit the side of his face where the canopy glass was gone. His left shoulder flared with pain after a near blackout pull where muscles had likely torn. Somewhere in the chaos, amid tracers and braking airplanes, doubt slipped in. He could break off now. No one would call it cowardice, not officially. He'd already done more than anyone could ask of a single pilot. Turning back meant he would almost certainly live. Staying meant flirting with the point where one lucky burst would end him and send the Junkyard Dog into the sea. He thought of the convoy, plowing through heavy swells, everyone aboard trusting someone in the sky to stand between them and the enemy. He thought of the mechanics who had poured themselves into this awkward air. He thought, unexpectedly, of the way other pilots had looked at him and his plane sideways, amused, dismissive. That Junkyard thing will get you killed. Maybe, or maybe this was the day it proved them wrong. He went back in. On what felt like his 10th pass but might have been the 6th, he caught the third bomber dead ahead from slightly above and to the side, guns lighting its cockpit and engine. It sagged out of formation, trailing fire. The survivors, now only 2 or 3, began to turn away, dropping altitude, searching for shelter in cloud. The Zeros grew more desperate. One came straight at him, head-on, guns blazing, refusing to break away. They'd both been closing at over 500 miles per hour. At that closure, there was no room for error, no chance of a leisurely barrel roll evasion. Instinct told him to jink aside. Pride and anger at the day, at the odds, at every time he'd been ridden off made him hold his course a fraction longer. The air between them filled with streaks of light. Bullets shattered the remaining canopy glass. A shard slashed his cheek. Another round slammed through the wing roof, the whole left side of the plane kicking as if hit by a sledgehammer. His own bullet struck the Zero squarely. The fighter exploded in a blossom of orange flame and debris. The shock wave hit the P-38 like a physical shove, flipping it sideways. A chunk of wreckage carved across his vertical stabilizer and vanished. The Junkyard Dog bucked, dipped, then wallowed. Warning lights flared on the panel. Oil sprayed along the left boom. Control field changed, mushier and vague. He wrestled her back under control, working damage controls by feel. For a moment, there was nothing in his vision but swinging horizon and bullet-scarred metal. When he steadied, the bombers were no longer bearing down on the convoy. The surviving few had turned west, retreating toward distant bases. The Zeros, too, were wheeling away, low on fuel and ammunition, mission spoiled. The air suddenly seemed enormous and empty. He realized that his gloved hands were shaking on the stick. Dutch Harbor, Lightning 3, he forced out. Enemy formation turning back. Multiple bombers down, fighters disengaging. Convoy should be safe for now. I am damaged and low on fuel. Returning to base, the reply came back faint but clear. Copy, 3, Sierra 59 confirms multiple splashes. You bought them their lives. Get yourself home. Get yourself home. Simple orders, difficult execution. He turned east. The fuel gauges sat uncomfortably low. The left engine's oil pressure needle flirted with the red. He throttled it back to just above idle, letting the right engine score, but still stronger do most. The damaged rudder made fine correction precise, like steering a car with loose steering linkage on black ice. Clouds closed in again. More than once he flew blind through dense gray, trusting his instruments and his mental map of these islands. He'd known pilots who made it through combat only to smear themselves across invisible ridgelines. When the jagged coastline finally punched up through the cloud layer, he felt an almost physical relief. The runway, a dark scratch on white stone, came into view, dusted with snow, crosswinds whipping a tattered windsock nearly flat. Dutch Harbor Tower, Lightning 3 on final. She's hurt. Request priority landing. 3, you are cleared straight in. Be advised, ice on runway, winds 20 gusting 30 across. Fire crew standing by, reassuring, he muttered. Then focused. He lined up, fighting the crosswind and the P-38's tendency to weather vane. At 50 feet, a gust hit, shoving the wounded plane sideways. The left wing dropped. For a terrifying second, the runway edge filled the cockpit. He reacted without thinking. A dab of power, a crisp aileron correction, just enough rudder authority left to bring the nose back. The Junkyard Dog slammed down hard, right wheel first, skidding, then the left. Tires shrieked on ice. They slewed, threatened to slide off into the snow, then straightened. The brakes grabbed, shuddering. The whole plane rattled its protest at this last indignity. When they finally rolled to a halt, his chest felt hollow. Engines off, switches out. In the sudden quiet, the ticking of cooling metal sounded absurdly loud. A jeep raced out. Men in parkas swarmed the plane. Ferguson's oil-streaked face appeared at the wing, eyes big. "Jesus, Lieutenant, we thought you weren't bringing this heap back." He peered into the shattered cockpit. "You okay?" Danny tried to answer and found his throat dry. He managed a nod, fumbling with the harness until hands reached in to help him. On the ground, standing unsteadily, he could finally see his machine from the outside. Bullet holes pocked the tail looked like someone had taken a bite out of it. Oil streaked back from the left engine. The canopy was almost entirely gone. The little piece of nose art one of the mechanics had painted a snarling mutt made of riveted plates was blackened and chipped, but still there. The squadron commander, Major Ellison, arrived in a jeep, coat collar up against the wind. He walked a slow circle around the P-38, taking in the damage. Then he faced Danny. "Report, Lieutenant." Danny straightened as best he could. "Sir, enemy force of 7 bombers and at least 6 fighters. Intercepted alone. I observed 4 bombers crash into the sea, 2 more heavily damaged and breaking formation. At least 3 fighters destroyed in air combat. Enemy turned back before reaching the convoy." Ellison steadied him. Then the plane again. "We're getting corroboration from the convoy," he said quietly. "They claim even more went down than you saw. Hard to tell in that mess." He paused. "Regardless, you just did the job of a full squadron." The Major's reputation was for being cold, unsentimental. Now he stuck out a gloved hand. "Hell of a piece of flying, Cole. And hell of a piece of work on that airplane. I called her a death trap. Looks like she proved me wrong." Danny shook his hand, embarrassed by the praise, feeling every bruise and cut now that the adrenaline was leaking away. Around them, the ground crew ran hands over torn metal, whistling softly. Morales slapped the patched fuselage with a kind of rough affection. "This dog's mean," he declared. "They should have sent her to Guadalcanal like this. War would have been over early." That night, after debriefing and a cursory patch-up at the medic's tent, Danny lay on his bunk staring up at the plywood ceiling while the island wind howled around the hut. The official tally was still being argued on paper, but he'd heard the whispers. At least 8 enemy planes confirmed destroyed, possibly more. Back in the States, that kind of day would have made headlines. Here, it meant hot coffee, a handshake from the Major, and orders to be ready to fly again when the plane could be coaxed back into the air. He reached over to the small table by his bed and picked up a worn photograph of his father in front of their old garage in Tacoma. For a long moment, he simply looked at that familiar, oil-stained grin. "Plane held together, Pop," he said softly. "Did what we built her to do. Got me home." Sleep, when it finally came, brought more falling shapes than glory. In the days that followed, the story began to spread first through the squadron, then up the chain. The numbers in his logbook climbed as intelligence and convoy reports were cross-checked. 14 enemy aircraft credited across multiple missions on this frozen front, bombers and fighters killed in the air by the Junkyard P-38 and the man stubborn enough to fly it. Newspaper correspondents passing through, starved for human interest out of this forgotten theater, latched on. They mocked his Junkyard plane until he downed 14 enemy fighters over Alaska alone. One headline would eventually proclaim, "Sanding off the rough edges of reality for the sake of myth." Never mind that several of those kills had been bombers, that they had been scored across months, not hours. The story was cleaner this way. On the base, what changed was simpler. Pilots who had laughed now nodded, gave him space in the mess line, asked for his thoughts on how the P-38 handled in thin, icy Aleutian. Mechanics who'd half-jokingly warned him not to blame them if the plane fell apart now were the Junkyard Dog's bullet holes like badges. One evening, Ferguson caught him staring at the P-38 as she sat in the hangar, stripped for a major rebuild. "You know," the crew chief said, "after this, you could ask for the best-looking bird on the field. Factory fresh, no patches. Nobody could deny you." Danny shrugged, eyes tracing the web of welds and reinforcement plates that had been added after the mission. "Problem is," he answered, "I don't know that plane. I know this one. I know every creak and cough." He smiled faintly. "Besides, I like underdogs." "Yeah, well," Ferguson replied, "just remember even underdogs need new bones now and then. She won't last forever." She didn't. By late 1944, with the Aleutian threat receding and newer aircraft available, the Junkyard Dog was finally rotated out. Too many combat hours on too many patch spars. She might serve as a trainer, maybe, or get picked apart for parts one last time. Either way, she would never again go into a head-on dive against incoming bombers. Watching her being towed away, Danny felt an unexpected. She doesn't owe us anything, Morales said quietly beside him. Maybe we owe her, Danny replied. When his own orders came stateside duty as an instructor, he wrestled with the same mix of relief and unease. Teaching green pilots in clear, continental skies felt like a different world from chasing Japanese bombers through Arctic storms. But he realized something important. If he could pass on what he had learned about flying imperfect machines in impossible conditions, maybe fewer rookies would die in nicer airplanes. After the war, back in Tacoma, the garage smell was comfortingly. His father's hair had thinned, his hands were more knotted, but his eyes lit the same way when an engine turned over. They sat together one evening with a stack of yellowed clippings and citations on the table between them. His father read in silence for a while, then looked up. 14, he said. They'd make a big deal of that. It's a number, Danny said. Useful for historians. Hard to sleep with. His father steadied his face, hearing what lay behind the words. Metal's honest, the older man said slowly. People turn it into stories however they need to. But you know what it really felt like. What it really felt like, Danny answered, was cold, lonely. Like every decision was the wrong one until you saw if anyone died because of it. Years rolled on. Books about the forgotten Aleutian campaign appeared. His name cropped up in some of them. Lt. Daniel Cole, an ace of the Aleutian, credited with 14 aerial victories flying heavily patched P-38 Lightning. The Junkyard Dog rated a paragraph or two, an example of wartime improvisation, an illustration in black and white. Eventually a museum invited him to speak at a small exhibit. They'd blown up that old photograph of him and his plane for the display. Young man in heavy flight gear, awkwardly half-smiling beside a fighter that looked more like a junk pile with engines. Standing in front of a couple dozen listeners, he did not talk much about the number. He talked about weather that killed as efficient, about mechanics working by feel because their fingers were too numb to trust, about flying a plane everyone doubted because supply lines were long and choices were short. And he talked about that day over the convoy. I'd love to tell you I stayed up there out of pure courage, he said. But it didn't feel pure. It felt like standing in a narrow hallway with fire at both ends. Going home meant living with the thought that those ships might die because I left. Staying meant maybe I died instead. In the end, what tipped it was simple. I knew that airplane. I trusted the men who had built her out of scrap. That trust let me push when common sense said to quit. After the talk, a student approached him. Isn't it strange, the young man asked, that people remember the Junkyard plane more than the actual tactics or the campaign? Danny glanced at the photo again. Not really, he said. Stories need symbols. A patched-up fighter and a mechanic's kid who flew it, that's something people can hang on. But if they remember it right, they'll see what's really underneath. Which is? That sometimes, he said, the difference between disaster and survival isn't the best equipment. It's people who refuse to accept that what they've been given is all it can be. His legacy never became a monument on a Capitol lawn. It lived in small things, a model of a mismatched P-38 in a museum case, a paragraph in a history book about Aleutian weather and stubborn air crews, a story passed from one old mechanic to his grandkids about a crazy pilot and the dog of a plane that wouldn't die. And somewhere inside the culture of flying, his story helped nudge a quiet truth a little closer to the surface, that in war and in life perfection is rare. More often, people win, survive, or save others with machines and circumstances that are flawed, improvised, not good enough on paper. That cold morning in 1943, over steel gray water and under a ceiling of dirty cloud, a pilot no one expected much from took a plane everyone laughed at and staked both their reputations on one impossible series of choices. Convoys that never knew his name lived because of it. Men went home because his Junkyard plane did not come apart when logic said it should. Years later, when someone asked him what he'd said to the P-38 after that first brutal mission, he chuckled. I patted the frame and said, "Thank you," he answered, out loud, like she could hear me. Maybe that gratitude was meant for the plane. Maybe it was for the mechanics, or for every beaten-up thing that had ever proved someone wrong. Either way, it pointed to the heart of the story. They mocked his Junkyard plane. They doubted the man who believed in it. But over Alaska's frozen frontier, when everything came down to one fighter, one pilot, and one convoy, it was that unlikely partnership that stood the test. Remembering that isn't about glorifying war. It's about honoring the people who made do with less and, in doing so, changed more than they ever knew. Because no one, and nothing, is just scrap. If this story moved you, help keep these forgotten World War II skies alive by liking this video, sharing it with a friend who loves history, and subscribing so you don't miss the next Untold mission.